What's going on, everybody? Sean Daniel here with GuitarControl.com, and today we're talking about efficiency. And efficiency only really matters in three circumstances: global carbon emissions, the distance my grandmother will drive to save 2 cents a gallon on fuel, and your hand positioning when we're executing open guitar chord positions. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I think the first thing that you learn when you start learning guitar chords is you learn them as different shapes, like a D major shape to G major to A major to E major to A minor, stuff like that. And we kind of solidify these shapes in our brain. And what ends up happening is we think of this as like an A minor chord, but we think of this as the A minor chord and not an A minor chord. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but I think a band that really uses efficient guitar chord shapes really well is AC/DC, right? So we're going to do something that sounds like this. You might recognize it's a pretty familiar song. So we've got three chords that go back and forth, right? And if we were to actually look at these chords, it'd be like an E major, and a G major, and an A major. But if we played them as you'll see these chords written out a lot of times in books and stuff, it would have to sound like this. And that's like a really quick thing to do, to switch from like a G major to an A major shape like this over and over again. So what we're going to do is we're going to take little pieces of these chords. So even though it's like an E chord, right, an E major chord, we don't have to play this whole thing. We can just play the first two notes of this, E and 2A, which is a B, right? So this is a root note and it's fifth. And anytime you see a major or minor chord, you can always replace that with its root and its fifth. In fact, that's a very kind of like rock thing to do, to not play an entire chord, to take a piece of a chord, or like a power chord. And the nice thing about this is if we just kind of think in pieces of chords, we can actually be a lot more efficient in how we change chords. So instead of going from like an E major to a G major, we can just go from this E right here, open E2A, and then just put your middle finger down on 3E. And as far as our purposes go, that counts as an E to a G. But it's really just kind of these little power chords, these little pieces. And then if we want to go to an A major, all you have to do is take your little shape here that we have for an E, and then just kind of roll your index finger down, and then just get open A and 2D. E, A, E, A. So these two chords are neither major nor minor. This is just kind of like a beefed up E note and an A. So you can use this anytime you see A minor or A major, and it'll sound pretty much correct. Same thing with this E. If it's E major or E minor, you don't even have to know. It's just kind of like a power chord, a piece of that chord to kind of get that E vibe going on, right? So now this is just one example of how you can kind of switch back and forth between E, G, A, G, A, G, E. And really, if I'm really trying to be as efficient as possible, it doesn't look like I'm barely moving my hand at all. It almost looks like I'm just playing maybe one chord. So this is kind of something I want you to focus on, is take little pieces of chords that you already know. Another thing we can do this with is like a D major or a D minor chord. Sometimes these can be, when you're first starting out, sometimes these are tough chords to get into because the shape of it is such a drastically different thing than maybe like to kind of get all your fingers to move in order like that. So really, we can just take part of this. So for a D chord, we can always replace with an open D, a 2A, and a 3B. Okay, now we're leaving out in a D major chord either the second fret on the high E string, or in a D minor chord, the first fret in a high E string. So again, this one right here, and again, I'm just hitting the D, G, and B string. I'm not getting the high E string in there. It can be replaced for either a D major or a D minor. You don't have to know if it's major or minor in this case, so it's really helpful. It's very useful in a lot of different keys. Okay, now coming from here, and when we're talking about switching chords effectively, it really does kind of come down to context. So there's really not a good way to memorize all the different shapes that you're going to be doing. It's just more of like a way to be more thoughtful about the chords that you're approaching. Because if I'm going from this D to like a C chord, right, like maybe something like this, well, it might be easier to just take a piece of the C chord, and instead of coming from like a D to a C, see how I kind of have to like move my wrist a little bit and kind of get my fingers. If it's like a really quick thing until I'm that fast, what I could do is I can just do this. So I'm just getting the front end of this C chord instead of getting the whole thing. I'm just getting maybe my middle finger on 3A and my pointer finger on 2D. It's almost kind of like a G chord down a string, G and C. So if you have a progression, it just depends on where you're coming from and where you're going to as far as which of these shapes to kind of use. And this is just something that'll help your playing a lot if you're just a little bit more thoughtful about it. So if I have a chord progression, which is really common, from like a G to a C, and maybe there's like a quick change like that, that can be a tough one at first. I can just go from this, the first half of this G, and again I'm just strumming maybe like the lower strings, and then just moving it down. And that counts as a G major to a C major. So because I'm coming from this G, I'm going to choose to just move that down. Now maybe I'm starting off with the C chord and the first chord is like this. So since I'm here, and the next one is a G, instead of doing that, I just do the inverse of that. I just move this up a string. So in that case, I'm almost kind of thinking of a C chord shape and moving that up to play a G chord. Now, there are a lot of benefits from this as far as like other chords that will be attainable to kind of change. So what I mean by that is, let's take another kind of common thing you'll see every now and then. You'll have a G chord to a G7 chord, okay? So a G7 chord is where you just take a G chord, but instead of the 3rd fret on the high E string, you have it on the 1st fret of the high E string. So to change from this G chord, to totally rearrange all your fingers just to get that one note is kind of inefficient. So if we know we're going to go to a G7 chord from a G, maybe you just play the G like this position and then have your pointer finger ready and waiting there, which is, again, really efficient to go to a C afterwards, okay? So the main thing to remember is that these shapes, these hand shapes that we learn to start off thinking of different chords, aren't the end-all be-all of the chords. It's not the only way to play a chord. It's just a suggestion, and a lot of times they're the more traditional and more common suggestions or voicings used to play these chords, but there are always different voicings and always different opportunities to play chords that may be easier as far as how quickly it takes your hand to get around there, okay? So what I want you to do is just take any song that you know, and then just maybe try to get away with cheating and shortening some of these chord voicings to make it easier for your hand to move around. And especially if you're at a point in your playing where maybe you're trying to strum and it takes a second to get into the next chord, and then your right hand is waiting for your left hand to gather on there. There are, like I promise you, there's probably a faster way to do it that may not have the full chord involved. You may actually kind of be sacrificing a little bit of the sound or maybe a little bit of volume, but it's going to be easier on your hands and it's going to be something that builds speed into your playing. And honestly, different chord voicings have different sounds too. Like this full C chord sounds different than this, sounds different than this, sounds different than this. So just kind of like the tone of all these chords matters too, and eventually you'll find ones that you like. And for sure, remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button, and any feedback or comments you have, leave them down there, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks a lot.